and her faith was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Therefore, she internalized the blame. She learned to associate religious authority directly with sexual violation and absolute unquestioning submission. She was taught that her body was inherently sinful, that obedience to a priest was paramount, and that the boundaries of her own physical autonomy were entirely irrelevant. Father Bavent did not just violate her body, he fundamentally rewired her psychology. He installed a trauma response that equated spiritual devotion with physical degradation. By the time she reached her late teens, the grooming was complete. She was a deeply devout young woman, entirely unaware that her spiritual compass had been deliberately shattered. The trauma of her childhood and the sustained sexual abuse by a trusted religious figure left her with severe psychological scars. She suffered from deep feelings of shame, anxiety, and a complete inability to trust her own instincts. In 1625, at the age of 18, Madeleine made a decision that she believed would finally bring her peace. Desperate to escape the lingering trauma of Rouen, the harsh reality of her life as a seamstress, and the suffocating presence of Father Bavent, she sought out the ultimate sanctuary. She decided to dedicate her life entirely to God. She left Rouen and traveled south to the town of Louviers. She had been accepted into the convent of the Franciscan Hospitaller Sisters. For Madeleine, walking through the heavy wooden doors of the convent felt like a salvation. She believed she was leaving behind a world of exploitation to enter a wholly protected sisterhood where she could serve God in peace and purity. She thought she was finally safe. She had no way of knowing that she had just traded a solitary predator for an entire institution of them. She was walking directly into an isolated pressure cooker run by men who would take the psychological fractures created by Father Bavent and use them to completely annihilate her mind. When Madeleine Bavent walked through the heavy wooden doors of the Franciscan Hospitaller convent at Louviers in 1625, the heavy iron latches locked behind her. To the outside world, she had become a bride of Christ, dedicating her life to poverty, chastity, and obedience. She believed she had found a sanctuary, a quiet fortress, where the trauma of her childhood and the predatory hands of Father Bavent could no longer reach her. But a convent in 17th century France was not a place of healing. It was a rigid, highly disciplined environment designed to break down the individual ego and enforce conformity. The architecture itself was a weapon of isolation. The stone walls were high, the windows were barred, and contact with the outside world was strictly prohibited. For the nuns of Louviers, reality was confined entirely to the stone corridors, the chapel, and the small freezing cells where they slept. The daily routine was grueling. The women were subjected to severe sleep deprivation. They were forced to wake hours before dawn to pray on cold stone floors. Their diets were heavily restricted, consisting of meager rations designed to severely discipline the body and keep it in a constant state of weakness. In an environment devoid of adequate nutrition, warmth, and rest, the human mind becomes fragile. The physiological effects of prolonged fasting and sleep deprivation include severe anxiety, suggestibility, and visual or auditory hallucinations. Historical accounts suggest the institution kept the women physically exhausted to ensure they remained spiritually compliant. The primary authority of this closed ecosystem was the convent's director, Father Mathurin Picard. In the hierarchical structure of the time, many historians note that a convent director wielded immense, almost absolute power over the nuns. He was their confessor, their judge, and their main connection to the divine. He controlled who received communion. He decided who was assigned grueling physical penances and who was publicly reprimanded for minor infractions. Picard was a highly charismatic, authoritative figure. Records indicate he understood exactly how to manipulate the vulnerabilities of the women under his control. But Picard was not a standard Orthodox priest. Behind the impenetrable walls of Louviers, and her faith was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Therefore, she internalized the blame. She learned to associate religious authority directly with sexual violation and absolute unquestioning submission. She was taught that her body was inherently sinful, that obedience to a priest was paramount, and that the boundaries of her own physical autonomy were entirely irrelevant. Father Bontemps did not just violate her body, he fundamentally rewired her psychology. He installed a trauma response that equated spiritual devotion with physical degradation. By the time she reached her late teens, the grooming was complete. She was a deeply devout young woman, entirely unaware that her spiritual compass had been deliberately shattered. The trauma of her childhood and the sustained sexual abuse by a trusted religious figure left her with severe psychological scars. She suffered from deep feelings of shame, anxiety, and a complete inability to trust her own instincts. In 1625, at the age of 18, Madeleine made a decision that she believed would finally bring her peace. Desperate to escape the lingering trauma of Rouen, the harsh reality of her life as a seamstress, and the suffocating presence of Father Bontemps, she sought out the ultimate sanctuary. She decided to dedicate her life entirely to God. She left Rouen and traveled south to the town of Louviers. She had been accepted into the convent of the Franciscan Hospitalier Sisters. For Madeleine, walking through the heavy wooden doors of the convent felt like a salvation. She believed she was leaving behind a world of exploitation to enter a holy, protected sisterhood where she could serve God in peace and purity. She thought she was finally safe. She had no way of knowing that she had just traded a solitary predator for an entire institution of them. She was walking directly into an isolated pressure cooker, run by men who would take the psychological fractures created by Father Bontemps and use them to completely annihilate her mind. When Madeleine Bavent walked through the heavy wooden doors of the Franciscan Hospitalier Convent at Louviers in 1625, the heavy iron latches locked behind her. To the outside world, she had become a bride of Christ, dedicating her life to poverty, chastity, and obedience. She believed she had found a sanctuary, a quiet fortress where the trauma of her childhood and the predatory hands of Father Bontemps could no longer reach her. But a convent in 17th century France was not a place of healing. It was a rigid, highly disciplined environment designed to break down the individual ego and enforce conformity. The architecture itself was a weapon of isolation. The stone walls were high, the windows were barred, and contact with the outside world was strictly prohibited. For the nuns of Louviers, reality was confined entirely to the stone corridors, the chapel, and the small freezing cells where they slept. The daily routine was grueling. The women were subjected to severe sleep deprivation, forced to wake hours before dawn to pray on cold stone floors. Their diets were heavily restricted, consisting of meager rations designed to mortify the flesh and keep the body in a constant state of weakness. In an environment devoid of adequate nutrition, warmth, and rest, the human brain begins to malfunction. The physiological effects of prolonged fasting and sleep deprivation include severe anxiety, suggestibility, and visual or auditory hallucinations. The institution intentionally kept the women physically exhausted to ensure they remained spiritually compliant. The absolute ruler of this closed ecosystem was the convent's director, Father Mathurin Picard. In the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church, the director of a convent wielded unquestionable totalitarian power over the nuns. He was their confessor, their judge, and their sole connection to the divine. He controlled who received communion, who was assigned grueling physical penances, and who was publicly humiliated for minor infractions. Picard was a highly charismatic, authoritative figure who understood exactly how to manipulate the vulnerabilities of the women under his control. But Picard was not a standard Orthodox priest. Behind the impenetrable walls of Louviers, hidden from the eyes of the regional bishops and the Vatican, he was running a cult. Picard secretly practiced a radical heretical theology known as Illuminism. This was a dangerous sect of mysticism that fundamentally twisted Catholic doctrine to serve the darkest human desires. Illuminism taught that the human spirit and the physical body were entirely separate entities. Picard manipulated the nuns into believing that if a soul was truly pure and entirely focused on God, it could not be tainted by the actions of the flesh. He preached that physical sins, including sexual acts, were entirely irrelevant to spiritual salvation. In fact, he argued that engaging in carnal acts without feeling spiritual guilt was the ultimate demonstration of divine detachment. It was a brilliantly terrifying psychological trap. Picard constructed a theology specifically designed to facilitate sexual abuse without triggering the religious guilt of his victims. He took women who had dedicated their entire lives to maintaining physical purity and convinced them that surrendering their bodies to him was actually a holy sacrament. For Madeleine, this environment was a catastrophic continuation of the nightmare she thought she had escaped. When Picard targeted her, he immediately recognized the psychological groundwork that Father Bontemps had already laid. Madeleine was deeply traumatized, terrified of authority, and conditioned to associate religious instruction with sexual compliance. Picard utilized the private, strict secrecy of the confessional booth to initiate his abuse. He did not use physical force. He used the overwhelming weight of his spiritual authority. When he initiated sexual contact, he framed it as a divine mystery, a test of her spiritual obedience. Madeleine's mind, already fractured from her youth, simply collapsed under the paradox. To resist the director of the convent was to resist God. To report him was impossible. He controlled all correspondence and communication with the outside world. To survive the daily horror of being repeatedly assaulted by the man tasked with saving her soul, Madeleine dissociated. She split her consciousness. The psychological term for this is a trauma-induced fugue state. During the abuse, her mind would detach from her physical body to protect itself from the unbearable reality of what was happening. She learned to exist in a state of permanent cognitive dissonance, participating in horrific violations, while desperately trying to maintain her identity as a devis. Out, holy sister! The toxicity of Louviers escalated with the arrival of Picard's assistant, Father Thomas Boulet. Boulet operated as Picard's enforcer and willing accomplice. With two predators operating in tandem, the abuse widened, becoming systematic and ritualistic. The convent ceased to function as a Catholic institution and morphed into a private playground for the two priests. They created a secret hierarchy among the sisters, pitting the women against each other. Nuns who complied with the Illuminist teachings and the sexual demands of the priests were rewarded with extra rations, lighter duties, and the illusion of spiritual favoritism. Those who resisted or questioned the doctrine were subjected to severe public physical penances, isolated from the rest of the community, and threatened with eternal damnation. Inside this echo chamber, reality became entirely subjective. There was no outside standard of morality to fact-check Picard and Boulet. The convent was consumed by paranoia and suspicion. Madeleine lived in a continuous state of sheer terror. She watched other nuns succumb to the abuse, while others slowly lost their grip on reality. As the 1620s bled into the 1630s, the years of sustained severe trauma began to manifest physically and psychologically in Madeleine. The human brain cannot endure a permanent state of extreme stress without fracturing. The dissociation that had initially protected her began to spiral out of control. She developed severe somatic symptoms, unexplained physical pains, sudden paralysis, and terrifying night terrors. Her mind, desperately trying to process the continuous sexual trauma and the warped religious theology, began to produce vivid, violent hallucinations. She saw shadows moving in the corners of her cell. She heard voices whispering blasphemies when she tried to pray. Today, these are easily recognizable as the devastating symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. But in the 17th century, the medical vocabulary for trauma did not exist. There was only the language of the supernatural. When Madeleine confessed her hallucinations to Picard, he did not offer her comfort or medical care. He actively weaponized her deteriorating mental state against her. He validated her terrifying visions, twisting them to further assert his control. He convinced her that the voices and the visions were proof that she was involved in a spiritual war, entirely dependent on him for her protection. He kept her constantly off balance, trapped in a cycle of severe abuse followed by manufactured spiritual comfort. For 17 years, Madeleine Bavent existed in this lightless psychological dungeon. From 1625 to 1642, she transitioned from a hopeful 18-year-old girl into a 35-year-old woman whose entire reality had been dictated, distorted, and destroyed by Mathurin Picard. She had no memory of a normal life. The cult of Louviers was a perfectly functioning machine of exploitation, operating silently behind thick stone walls, completely undetected by the Vatican or the French state. Picard was the undisputed king of this hidden world. The entire ecosystem of the convent, the carefully constructed theology of Illuminism, and the silence of the abused nuns relied entirely on his terrifying charismatic presence. The system was stable because Picard controlled every variable. But in 1642, the linchpin of the Louviers cult was abruptly removed. Father Mathurin Picard died suddenly. He did not face a trial. He was not exposed or punished for his decades of predatory abuse. He simply died, leaving the convent entirely rudderless. For the Catholic Church, the death of a regional convent director was a minor administrative issue, but inside the walls of Louviers, Picard's death triggered an immediate, catastrophic shockwave. The man who had dictated their reality, the man who had terrified and abused them, was suddenly gone. the delicate, highly toxic balance of the convent shatter. Overnight. The nuns, carrying decades of suppressed trauma, starvation, and psychological torture, were suddenly left without their abuser to enforce the silence. The pressure cooker was about to explode, and Madeleine Bavent's fragile, fractured mind was positioned directly at ground zero. The true horror of Louviers was no longer going to be contained behind closed doors. It was about to spill out into the open, catching the attention of men who were far more dangerous and far more politically ambitious than Mathurin Picard could have ever dreamed of being. The death of Father Mathurin Picard in 1642 did not bring liberation to the convent of Louviers. It brought absolute, unmitigated terror. For the average citizen, the sudden passing of a regional priest was a mundane reality of 17th century life. But for Madeleine Bavent and the women trapped behind the high stone walls of the Franciscan Hospitaller Convent, Picard was not just a priest. He was the architect of their entire reality. For nearly 2 decades, he had controlled their sleep, their food, their theological understanding, and their physical bodies. He had conditioned them to believe that their salvation depended entirely on their submission to his abuse. When he died, the psychological dam that had held back years of horrific, suppressed trauma broke. In the immediate aftermath of his death, a chilling silence fell over the convent. The nuns were left in a sudden, terrifying vacuum of authority. They had no coping mechanisms, no external support system, and no way to process the decades of sexual and psychological violence they had endured. They were starving, exhausted, and fundamentally broken women suddenly left alone in the dark. For Madeleine, the loss of her primary abuser triggered a catastrophic mental collapse. The human brain, when pushed beyond the limits of its endurance, will often bypass the conscious mind entirely and express its agony through the physical body. In modern psychiatry, this is known as conversion disorder. In 1642, it looked like sheer madness. Madeleine began to suffer from violent, uncontrollable bodily convulsions. Her limbs would jerk and contort in unnatural angles. She would fall to the freezing stone floors, her back arching in excruciating spasms, gasping for air as her throat seemingly closed on its own. The dissociation that had previously protected her during Picard's assaults now turned against her. She began to experience vivid, terrifying hallucinations. She claimed to see the ghost of Father Picard standing in the corners of the convent, whispering to her, commanding her, and threatening her with eternal damnation. She was projecting her unresolved trauma into the physical space around her. The ghost she saw was not a supernatural entity. It was the manifestation of a severely battered psyche, entirely unable to let go of its tormentor. In a closed, highly superstitious environment, trauma of this magnitude is highly contagious. The other nuns in the convent watched Madeleine's violent physical breakdowns with mounting horror. These women were already existing on the razor's edge of sanity, weakened by malnutrition and their own silent abuses under Picard and his surviving assistant, Father Thomas Boulay. Seeing Madeleine thrashing on the floor, screaming at invisible figures, and speaking in fragmented, delirious sentences acted as a psychological trigger. Within weeks, the convent descended into chaos. The hysteria spread from Madeleine to the other sisters like a virulent disease. Nuns who had previously been quiet and obedient suddenly began collapsing in the middle of Mass. They shrieked blasphemies, tore at their own clothing, and threw themselves against the stone walls. Women who had taken vows of silence began barking like dogs, swearing violently, and exhibiting impossible physical strength during their spasms. It was a textbook outbreak of mass psychogenic illness. The collective trauma of the Louviers cult, held in check for years by Picard's iron fist, was violently erupting. The women were not faking their symptoms. Their bodies and minds genuinely believed they were under attack. They were physically acting out the violence that had been done to them in secret. Rumors of the chaos could not be contained behind the convent walls. Whispers began to bleed into the surrounding town of Louviers. The local populace heard the screams echoing from the convent at night. Stories of nuns contorting in unnatural shapes and speaking in strange voices spread through the taverns and markets. Eventually, the reports reached the ears of the regional religious authorities. The Bishop of Évreux, the man holding absolute ecclesiastical jurisdiction over the area, dispatched investigators to the convent to assess the situation. When the church officials walked through the doors of Louviers, they were greeted by a scene of unimaginable human suffering. They saw dozens of women severely malnourished, covered in bruises from their own convulsions, terrified and psychologically shattered. A compassionate observer would have recognized an urgent medical and humanitarian crisis. They would have seen victims, but the investigators from the Diocese of Évreux did not see victims. They saw a profound, highly lucrative political opportunity. To understand the cold, calculating reaction of the religious authorities, we must zoom out and look at the broader political machinery of 17th century France. The church was not just a spiritual institution, it was a ruthless corporate in state power. And just 8 years prior, in 1634, the church had discovered the ultimate weapon of political control in a town called Loudun. During the Loudun affair, a convent of Ursuline nuns had experienced a very similar outbreak of mass hysteria. The powerful Cardinal Richelieu, acting as the chief minister to the French king, recognized that he could use the nuns' hysteria to eliminate a political rival, a rebellious, charismatic local priest named Urbain Grandier. The church officially declared the Loudun nuns to be possessed by demons, and they blamed Grandier for summoning them. The accusation of demonic witchcraft was a legal masterstroke. It bypassed all standard requirements for physical evidence. The delirious, coerced testimonies of the possessed nuns were accepted as divine, undeniable truth. Urbain Grandier was tortured, convicted of witchcraft, and burned alive at the stake. The Louviers Exorcisms were a spectacular success for the state. They eliminated a threat, terrified the local populace into total submission, and dramatically reinforced the absolute power of the Catholic Church. It proved that staging a demonic possession was the most effective way to legally murder an enemy. The Bishop of Évreux and the regional Inquisition looked at the screaming, convulsing women of Louviers and immediately recognized the exact same blueprint. The regional church authorities had long suspected that the late Father Picard and his surviving assistant, Father Thomas Boulet, were running a rogue heretical sect within the convent. The Illuminist teachings were a direct threat to Orthodox Catholic control. The church needed to completely eradicate Picard's legacy, purge the convent of his influence, and make a terrifying public example of Father Boulet. However, they could not simply arrest Boulet for sexual abuse or poor management. Sexual transgressions by priests were common, and often quietly swept under the rug by the Vatican to avoid public embarrassment. Abuse was merely a sin, but witchcraft, summoning demons to possess holy nuns, was a capital crime. It carried the death penalty. It allowed the state to confiscate property, publicly execute the offender and completely annihilate their legacy. The trap was systematically set. The bishop's investigators completely ignored the blatant signs of starvation, isolation, and institutional rape. They did not offer the women food, medical care, or psychological sanctuary. Instead, they drafted an official report diagnosing the mass hysteria as a full-scale catastrophic demonic infestation. They declared that the nuns of Louviers were not sick. They were vessels for the armies of hell. With the stroke of a pen, Madeleine Bavent's role was fundamentally altered. She was no longer a traumatized orphan suffering from severe PTSD. She was elevated to the status of patient zero in a demonic plague. The Inquisition officially took jurisdiction over the convent. They brought in professional exorcists, men who were not spiritual healers, but hardened, experienced interrogators trained in the art of breaking human minds. The convent doors were locked once again, but this time the threat was not coming from a rogue priest. The threat was the full, terrifying weight of the Catholic state. Madeleine, exhausted, terrified, and completely disconnected from reality, was separated from the other sisters. She was dragged into a cold, isolated cell. The religious authorities did not want to cure her madness. They needed to harness it, shape it, and point it directly at the men they wanted to burn. The psychological grooming she had endured as a child and the horrific sexual abuse she had suffered under Picard were merely the prelude. The true torture of Madeleine Bavent was about to begin, officially sanctioned and meticulously recorded by the highest religious authorities in the land. When the heavy wooden doors of the isolation cell slammed shut, Madeleine Bavent was entirely severed from the outside world. The year was 1643, and the Inquisition had officially taken control of the Louviers convent. The chaotic, screaming halls of the monastery were silenced, replaced by the cold, methodical machinery of a state-sanctioned witch trial. The religious authorities had declared a demonic infestation, and they required a vessel to prove it. Madeleine, already psychologically shattered and physically exhausted, instead was selected to be the primary conduit through which the church would enact its political purge. She was dragged down into the darkest, most isolated quarters of the convent. She was stripped of her religious habit, a symbolic eradication of her holy status. The men who entered her cell were not the compassionate spiritual healers one might associate with the modern concept of a priest. They were hardened professional exorcists and inquisitors dispatched by the Bishop of Évreux. They were essentially ecclesiastical lawyers and interrogators, men trained in the dark, highly specific art of breaking the human mind and extracting legally binding confessions. To comprehend the sheer horror of what Madeleine endured next, we must completely discard the cinematic supernatural portrayals of exorcism. A 17th century exorcism was not a spiritual battle of prayer and holy water. It was a grueling, protracted regime of enhanced interrogation and physical torture. It was designed with cold clinical precision to completely annihilate a suspect's grip on reality. The first weapon the inquisitors deployed was extreme physiological deprivation. Madeleine was subjected to severe, prolonged sleep deprivation. Guards and priests stood watch over her, forcing her to remain awake for days at a time. If she began to nod off from sheer exhaustion, they would violently jolt her awake with loud noises, physical strikes, or dousing her in freezing water. Combined with a starvation diet of stale bread and foul water, her body was rapidly drained of its basic survival resources. Modern medical science understands exactly what happens to a human brain under these conditions. Severe sleep deprivation induces a state of acute psychosis. The boundaries between waking life and nightmares completely dissolve. The brain begins to involuntarily hallucinate, producing terrifying visual and auditory stimuli. Cognitive function plummets, and the victim becomes hyper-suggestible, desperate to to anything that will simply allow them to close their eyes and rest. Madeleine, whose mind was already prone to trauma-induced fugue states and dissociation, was completely defenseless against this biological assault. Once her physical defenses were neutralized, the Inquisitors escalated to direct bodily torture. They needed physical proof of her demonic pact. According to the witch-hunting manuals of the era, a person who had signed a pact with the devil carried a devil's mark, a hidden spot on their body that felt no pain and would not bleed when pierced. To find this mark, the priests employed a horrific practice known as pricking. Madeleine was physically restrained, stripped naked, and surrounded by men wielding long, unsterilized iron needles. They systematically and repeatedly stabbed her flesh, searching for a spot that yielded no reaction. The cruelty of this practice lies in its terrifying psychological paradox. Because Madeleine was in a state of profound clinical shock, severely dissociated from her own body due to decades of sexual abuse and current physical torture, she frequently did not react to the needle strikes. Her traumatized brain had essentially severed the connection to her nerve endings as a defense mechanism. When the long needles pierced her skin and she did not scream, the Inquisitors did not see a woman in deep medical shock. They saw absolute, undeniable proof of demonic allegiance. Her trauma response was recorded as legal evidence of her guilt. The physical torture, however, was merely the foundation. The true objective of the exorcists was psychological submission. They needed a confession, but not just any confession. They needed a highly specific, politically useful narrative that would allow the regional authorities to execute their rivals. They utilized a technique that mirrors modern aggressive gaslighting, perfectly calibrated to destroy whatever fragile remnants of Madeleine's memory remained. When they interrogated him, they did not ask open-ended questions. They did not ask her what she had experienced under the deceased Father Mathurin Picard. Instead, they fed her the exact narrative they required, battering her with leading questions while she was in a state of delirious panic. "Did Father Picard take you to the witch's Sabbath?" they would scream at her in the freezing cell. "Did you sign a pact with the devil using your own blood? Did Father Thomas Boulay orchestrate the demonic orgies? Did you eat the roasted flesh of unbaptized infants in the convent basement?" For a healthy mind, these accusations would be absurd. But Madeleine's mind was not healthy. It had been systematically dismantled since she was an orphaned child in Rouen. She had been groomed to believe that priests spoke with the absolute authority of God. If these powerful, terrifying men were telling her that she had attended a witch's Sabbath, her broken psyche began to accept it as the truth. The horrific sexual abuse she had actually suffered at the hands of Picard, the late-night assaults, the twisted Illuminist theology, the secrecy, began to warp and morph into the demonic narrative the Inquisitors were forcing upon her. Her actual memories of being raped by a priest were terrifyingly rewritten into memories of being violated by demons. The boundary between her historical trauma and the Church's fabricated lies completely vanished. The interrogation dragged on for weeks. The relentless cycle of starvation, needle pricking, sleep deprivation, and psychological battering finally achieved its objective. Madeleine Bavent reached the absolute breaking point of human endurance. Her mind surrendered. She entered a state of total compliance, a psychological phenomenon where the victim entirely internalizes the reality of their captors. She began to confess, but the words coming out of her mouth were not her own. She was reciting the exact script the inquisitors had drilled into her head. She wept and trembled up as she admitted to attending horrific satanic orgies in the catacombs beneath the convent. She confessed to marrying a demon named Dagon. She confirmed that the deceased father, Mathurin Picard, was the ringleader of a massive satanic cult operating within the Franciscan order. But the most crucial element of her coerced confession, the political payload the Bishop of Évreux desperately needed, was her testimony against the living. Under intense pressure, Madeleine implicated Father Thomas Boulay. She stated on the official record that Boulay had actively participated in the demonic rituals, that he had bewitched the other nuns, and that he was an active agent of the devil. The moment she uttered Boulay's name and confirmed the existence of the cult, the Inquisition had exactly what it wanted. The religious authorities meticulously transcribed her delirious, trauma-induced ramblings. The scribes, sitting in the corner of her freezing cell, did not record the hesitation, the exhaustion, or the obvious signs of a complete mental breakdown. They recorded cold, hard, legal facts. They translated the desperate cries of a tortured, mentally ill woman into airtight ecclesiastical documents. They took the signature of a woman who no longer knew her own name and attached it to a piece of paper that would serve as a death warrant. The moment Madeleine Bavent's trembling hand signed the Inquisition's fabricated confession, the heavy, suffocating silence of her isolation cell was replaced by the deafening roar of the French legal machinery. It was 1643, and the ecclesiastical trap had closed entirely. The religious authorities had extracted exactly what they needed from her shattered mind: a legally binding document detailing demonic pacts, satanic orgies, and, most importantly, the direct complicity of Father Thomas Boulay and the deceased Father Mathurin Picard. She had handed the state a loaded weapon, completely unaware of the absolute devastation it was about to unleash. The investigation phase within the Louviers convent was immediately terminated. The Inquisition took their prized, blood-stained documents and marched them directly to the Parliament of Normandy, situated in the powerful city of Rouen. This transition from the secret tribunals of the Church to the highest secular courts of the region is a crucial element in understanding the true nature of the 17th century witch trials. The Church did not have the authority to execute citizens. They could only investigate, torture, and condemn. They required the secular government to actually light the fires. But the Parliament of Rouen was not an impartial body of justice. In an era where the fear of the devil was woven into the very fabric of society, defying the Inquisition was politically suicidal. The judges did not scrutinize the methods used to extract Madeleine's confession. They did not question why a severely malnourished, mentally broken woman was suddenly speaking in the highly structured theological language of a trained exorcist. They simply accepted the documents as divine, indisputable truth. It took 4 long years to meticulously build the case, during which Madeleine was kept in a state of suspended animation, locked away in a cell, periodically dragged out to confirm her delirious testimony whenever the prosecutors required a fresh injection of horror for the public record. By 1647, the stage was perfectly set. The regional authorities were ready to execute their purge. Father Thomas Boulay, the surviving assistant who had helped Picard run the abusive Illuminist cult within the convent, was formally charged with witchcraft, heresy, and commanding legions of demons. Boulay was an abuser, a man who had undoubtedly participated in the horrific sexual and psychological exploitation of the nuns, but he was not standing trial for rape or institutional abuse. The church had entirely bypassed his actual crimes to convict him of an impossible supernatural fiction, like Maddie. Eileen. He was subjected to brutal interrogations, but unlike the traumatized nuns, Boulay was a priest, a man who understood the political reality of what was happening. He knew that the trial was a sham designed to obliterate his faction. He fought the charges, but the sheer weight of the evidence, the coerced testimonies of the women he had helped traumatize, was insurmountable. In the late summer of 1647, the Parliament handed down its sentence. Father Thomas Boulay was condemned to die. The execution was designed to be a spectacular, terrifying demonstration of absolute power. The authorities did not want Boulay to die quietly in a dungeon. They needed the entire region to watch him burn. They needed the public to see what happened to anyone whose theology deviated from the orthodox control of the bishop and the state. On the day of the execution, the city of Rouen came to a standstill. Thousands of citizens crammed into the public square, the exact same cobblestones where Joan of Arc had been incinerated 2 centuries earlier. The atmosphere was a volatile mixture of religious fervor and morbid, carnival-like anticipation. Father Boulay was dragged from his cell. He was not afforded the dignity of a swift execution. He was placed on a hurdle, a wooden frame tied to the back of a horse, and dragged through the filthy streets of Rouen, subjected to the jeers and projectiles of the massive crowd. When he finally reached the execution site, he was bound to a heavy wooden stake, surrounded by massive bundles of dry faggots. The executioners did not show mercy. In some witch trials, the condemned were discreetly strangled before the flames reached them. Boulay was afforded no such grace. He was burned alive. The horrific reality of a public burning is difficult for the modern mind to fully grasp. It is not a quick death. It is a slow, agonizing process of asphyxiation and severe thermal shock. The screams of the condemned man echoed off the stone buildings, carrying over the heads of the crowd, serving as a visceral auditory warning to anyone harboring rebellious thoughts against the church. But the political ambitions of the Inquisition were not satisfied with the screams of a living man. Thomas Boulay was only the assistant. The true architect of the Louviers cult, the man whose radical Illuminist teachings the church desperately needed to erase from history, was Father Madeleine Picard. The fact that Picard had been dead for 5 years did not deter the authorities. In the twisted, terrifying logic of the 17th century legal system, a corpse could still be held accountable for heresy. To ensure the total, absolute eradication of their rivals, the Parliament ordered the exhumation of Picard's body. Gravediggers were dispatched to his resting place. They unearthed his coffin, pried off the lid, and hauled his decaying skeletal remains up into the daylight. What followed was an act of profound calculated barbarism. The rotting corpse of Father Madeleine Picard was officially indicted, found guilty, and sentenced to the exact same punishment as his living accomplice. The authorities tied the decomposing body to a hurdle and dragged it through the streets of Rouen, tracing the exact same path that Boulay had taken just hours before. The sight of a dead man being paraded to his own execution whipped the crowd into a frenzy. It was the ultimate grotesque humiliation. By punishing the dead, the church was sending a clear theological message. Their power did not end at the grave. They could pursue their enemies into the afterlife, deny them a Christian burial, and physically obliterate their remains to prevent any possibility of resurrection. When the procession reached the public square, the executioners hurled the decaying corpse of Mathurin Picard directly into the roaring flames that were still consuming the body of Thomas Boulay. The two men who had ruled the Louviers convent with absolute predatory impunity were reduced to a single, indistinguishable pile of ash. As the fires died down and the ashes of Picard and Boulay cooled on the cobblestones of Rouen, the Inquisition secured its absolute victory. The Loudun blueprint had worked flawlessly once again. The massive crowds dispersed, and the crisis of the Louviers convent was officially resolved. But the human weapon the state had used to achieve this purge was still sitting in a freezing dungeon. Madeleine Bavent had served her purpose perfectly. She had bled, hallucinated, and provided the exact confessions required to light the pyres. Now, with the trial concluded, she was a massive political liability. If she were released and her shattered mind began to heal, she might recant her confession, destroying the church's credibility. The solution the church settled upon was an act of profound, silent cruelty. They decided to bury her alive. The religious authorities officially stripped Madeleine of her religious habit. This was not merely a change of clothing. It was the final devastating psychological blow. Since she was an orphaned child in the streets of Rouen, the identity of a devout Catholic was the only thing she had ever possessed. It was the only shield she had against a brutal world. By formally excommunicating her and taking away her veil, the church completely erased her identity. She was officially declared a pariah, a woman forever tainted by her association with the devil, entirely unworthy of God's grace. She was condemned to life imprisonment. The guards dragged her away from the ecclesiastical courts and threw her into the secular dungeon of Rouen. To understand the reality of her final years, you must strip away any modern concept of a prison. A 17th century French dungeon was an oubliette, a place specifically designed for people the state wanted to forget. Her cell was likely deep underground, devoid of natural light, ventilation, or basic sanitation. The stone walls ran slick with freezing moisture. Her existence was reduced to 4 damp walls, the sound of dripping water and a daily ration of moldering bread and foul water shoved through a slot in a heavy iron door. In this lightless hole, Madeleine Bavent was finally left entirely alone with her own mind. The tragedy of her isolation is almost too immense to quantify. For her entire life, her reality had been dictated by predatory men. Father Bontemps had groomed her youth. Father Picard had violently abused her adulthood. The Inquisition had tortured her and rewritten her memories. She had never known a single day of genuine physical autonomy or psychological safety. Now, locked in the dark, the adrenaline of the trials faded, and the sheer crushing weight of her trauma settled over her. Without the inquisitors screaming narratives into her ear, the manic hallucinations likely subsided, leaving behind the devastating clarity of what she had endured and what she had been forced to facilitate. She was a woman who had sought sanctuary in the church only to be systematically raped, tortured, and used to legally murder other human beings. The God she had dedicated her life to had seemingly abandoned her to the monsters in robes. She spent 5 agonizing years in that dungeon. Her body, already severely weakened by decades of extreme fasting, institutional neglect, and the physical torture of the exorcists, began to rapidly fail. The damp cold of the cell invited respiratory diseases, while the starvation diet ensured she had zero immune response. She slowly starved and withered in the absolute darkness. In 1652, at the age of 45, Madeleine Bavent died. There was no public announcement. There were no grieving relatives to claim her body. She was not granted the dignity of a marked grave or a Christian burial. The guards simply removed her emaciated corpse from the cell and disposed of it. The ultimate erasure of a human being was complete. The Catholic Church had consumed her entire life, from her orphaned child's, stewed to her final breath in a freezing dungeon, and then swept her remains into the dustbin of history. When we look back at the Louviers Exorcism today, separated by centuries of medical and psychological advancement, the true horror of the story reveals itself with striking clarity. The monsters in this narrative did not have horns, nor did they crawl out of the catacombs. The real demons were the mechanisms of unchecked institutional power. At the age of 45, Madeleine Bavent died in the freezing dark of a Rouen dungeon. There was no public announcement and no marked grave. The church simply disposed of her emaciated corpse, completing her erasure. Today, her horrific ordeal stands as a permanent indictment of unchecked institutional power. Madeleine was not possessed by demons. She was a victim of severe complex trauma, weaponized by the very men sworn to protect her. The true monsters of Louviers did not crawl from the catacombs. They wore the robes of the state, orchestrating a ruthless political purge and leaving a broken, orphaned woman to pay the ultimate price.